The blood streaked her face, a stark crimson against her ashen skin as she lay motionless beside the creek, her long auburn hair partially submerged in the gentle current. Thomas Porter dropped to his knees beside the unconscious woman, his heart hammering against his ribs as he gently lifted her head from the water. The setting sun cast long shadows across the rugged Nevada landscape, turning the waters of the Awahi Creek to liquid gold, a cruel contrast to the grim scene before him. "Wake up," he whispered, cradling her head carefully. His calloused fingers brushed strands of wet hair from her face. "Wake up. Your battle is over." She didn't stir. Thomas glanced over his shoulder at the empty trail behind him, knowing he was at least 5 miles from town with nightfall approaching and a wounded stranger in his arms. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, the only sign she still clung to life. The wound on her temple was deep, but head wounds always bled worse than they were. At least, that's what he told himself as he lifted her into his arms. "You're going to be all right, miss," he murmured, though she couldn't hear him. "I've got you now." The year was 1878, and the Nevada Territory was still wild enough that finding a woman alone and injured raised all manner of questions. But those would have to wait. Thomas carefully placed her across his horse, mounting behind her to keep her secure against his chest as they began the journey back to his cabin. The woman stirred slightly as they crossed a particularly rocky stretch, a soft moan escaping her lips. "Easy there," Thomas soothed, adjusting his hold to cushion her from the jolting movement. "Just a little further." His cabin appeared on the horizon just as the last light faded from the sky. It wasn't much, a simple one-room structure built with his own hands after he'd claimed this patch of land 3 years prior, but it offered shelter and safety. Thomas dismounted carefully, lifting the woman into his arms once more. Inside, he placed her on his bed, quickly lighting a lantern to better assess her injuries. In the warm glow, he could see she was young, perhaps 25, with delicate features despite the grime and blood. Her clothes were quality, but travel-worn, a simple dress that had once been blue but was now dusty and torn. No wedding ring, he noted absently as he fetched water and clean rags. As he dabbed at the wound on her temple, her eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes of startling blue. They widened in panic as she gasped, trying to scramble away. "Easy now," Thomas said, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "You're safe. I found you by the creek, hurt. I'm just trying to help." "Who?" Her voice broke and she winced, raising a hand to her head. "My name's Thomas Porter. You're at my cabin about 5 miles southeast of Awahi." He offered her a cup of water. "Can you tell me your name, miss?" She took the cup with trembling hands, drinking deeply before answering. Josephine Miller." Her eyes darted around the cabin, assessing. "How did I found you unconscious by the creek? You've got a nasty wound there." Thomas nodded toward her temple. "Don't suppose you remember how you came by it?" Josephine closed her eyes, her brow furrowing. "I was traveling on the stage from Elko. We were attacked." Her eyes flew open. "The others? There were other passengers. I didn't see anyone else," Thomas said quietly. "Just you by the creek. If the stage was attacked, it must have been elsewhere. You may have wandered after." Tears welled in her eyes. "They shot the driver. We went off the road near the bend by the creek. The men, they were taking everything." Her hand went to her neck, finding nothing. "My locket. They took my locket." Thomas watched her carefully. Stage robberies weren't uncommon, but they'd increased in frequency lately. "How long ago was this?" I can't remember. They hit me when I fought back." A tear slipped down her cheek. "I ran. That's all I remember." Thomas nodded, offering her a clean cloth for her tears. "You're safe now. We'll get word to the sheriff in the morning, but you should rest tonight." He stood, intending to make a pallet for himself on the floor. "Please," she said suddenly, reaching for his wrist. "Don't leave me alone." The fear in her eyes tugged at something in Thomas's chest. "I'll be right here, Miss Miller, I promise." "Josie," she corrected softly. "Everyone calls me Josie." "Then I'll stay right here, Josie," Thomas replied, settling into the chair beside the bed. "Try to sleep. Morning comes early in these parts." As she drifted into an uneasy sleep, Thomas studied her face in the lantern light. He had many questions, but they would wait. For now, he would keep his promise and watch over her through the night. Thomas Porter had been a solitary man since coming west. At 30 years old, he'd left his home in Pennsylvania with nothing but a handful of savings and the skills his father had taught him. The war had taken too much from his family and his hometown, leaving behind ghosts he couldn't outrun. So he'd come west, where a man could build something new from nothing but hard work and determination. His cattle ranch was modest but growing. He ran about 100 head on the land he'd claimed, with help from just 2 hired hands who lived in a bunkhouse a short distance from his cabin. The arrangement suited him enough company when needed, but plenty of solitude too. Yet as the night wore on and he watched the gentle rise and fall of Josie's chest, Thomas found himself thinking about how long it had been since he'd shared his space with another person. How long since he'd worried over someone else's well-being. It was a strange feeling, but not entirely unwelcome. When the first light of dawn broke through the cabin's single window, Thomas rose stiffly from the chair. Josie still slept, her color improved from the night before. He moved quietly, stoking the fire and putting coffee on to boil before stepping outside to tend to his morning chores. His ranch hands, Miguel and Owen, were already at the barn when he arrived. "Morning, boss," Owen called, looking up from where he was mending a bridle. At 20, he was the younger of the two, a lanky boy from Oregon who drifted south looking for work. "Morning," Thomas replied. "Listen, we've got a situation. Found a woman injured by the creek last night, stage robbery victim. She's resting at my cabin now, but I need one of you to ride into town and fetch the doctor and the sheriff." Miguel straightened, concern etching his weathered face. "How bad is she hurt, patron?" "Head wound, but she was conscious and talking last night." "Still, I'd feel better having Doc Bennett take a look." Thomas turned to Owen. "Think you could make the ride? And tell Sheriff Hawkins there was a stage robbery yesterday, somewhere along the creek bend. Might be others hurt." Owen nodded, immediately setting aside his work. "I'll go right away." "Take my stallion. He's faster." Thomas handed him a few coins. "And bring back some supplies, whatever the doctor says might help, and maybe something for her to eat that isn't trail beans." After Owen departed, Thomas returned to the cabin to find Josie awake, sitting up in bed with the quilt pulled around her shoulders. Her hair had dried overnight, falling in waves around her face, the deep auburn catching the morning light. "You're up," he said, oddly pleased to see her looking stronger. "How's the head?" "Pounding," she admitted with a small smile. "But I'll live, thanks to you." Thomas poured her a cup of coffee, adding a generous spoonful of sugar the way his mother had always taken it. "I've sent for the doctor and the sheriff. They should be here in a few hours." Josie accepted the coffee gratefully. "Thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found me. No need to think about that." Thomas settled at the small table. "Mind if I ask what brings you to Awahi? Not many women travel these roads alone." A shadow crossed her face. "I wasn't meant to be alone. My brother was supposed to meet the stage in Elko, but he never arrived. The station master said there was a telegram saying he'd been delayed, so I decided to continue on rather than wait." She sighed. "Perhaps not my wisest decision. Your brother lives in Awahi. James took a position as a school teacher there last spring." I've been in San Francisco since our parents died, but James wrote that he was settled now and had found a place for us both. Her fingers tightened around the cup. I hope he's not worried. He would have expected me yesterday. Thomas nodded. The sheriff can send word to him when he comes. I'm sure your brother will be relieved to know you're safe. And what about you, Mr. Porter? Have you been in Awahi long? 3 years now. Built this place myself. He gestured around the simple cabin. It's not much, but it's mine. It's lovely, she said sincerely. There's something to be said for a home built by one's own hands. Thomas found himself wanting to know more about her, what had brought her to San Francisco, what she thought of Nevada, whether she planned to stay with her brother for long. But before he could frame another question, a knock at the door announced the arrival of Doc Bennett, who'd made the journey in record time. The doctor was a gruff man in his 60s who'd been treating the citizens of Awahi and the surrounding ranches for over 20 years. He examined Josie's wound with practiced efficiency, pronouncing her lucky. Nasty bump, but no fracture that I can feel. You'll have a headache for a few days, and I'd advise rest, but you'll make a full recovery. He handed Thomas a small bottle. Laudanum for the pain if it gets bad, but use it sparingly. Sheriff Hawkins arrived just as the doctor was finishing. Unlike the doctor, the sheriff was a newcomer to Awahi, having taken the job after the previous sheriff retired just 6 months earlier. He was younger than Thomas had expected for the position, perhaps 35, with a serious demeanor that commanded respect. Miss Miller, I understand you were involved in a stage robbery, he began, pulling out a notebook. I'd appreciate if you could tell me everything you remember. Josie recounted the attack, how the stage had been forced to stop by 3 masked men, how the driver had been shot when he reached for his gun, how the passengers were ordered out and relieved of their valuables. There were 4 other passengers, an older couple, a businessman from Carson City, and a young man headed for the silver mines, she explained. They took everything, money, jewelry, even the businessman's pocket watch. When they grabbed my locket, I fought back. It was foolish, but it was my mother's. That's when they hit you, the sheriff asked, making notes. Yes, with the butt of a pistol, I think. I remember falling and then one of them saying to leave me, that I was dealt with. They were arguing about what to do with the others. I managed to slip away into the brush while they were distracted. She shuddered. I don't know what happened after that. I just ran. And you ended up by the creek where Mr. Porter found you, the sheriff concluded. Can you describe any of these men? Anything distinctive about their voices or appearance? They wore bandanas over their faces. One was tall with a scar on his hand I noticed when he grabbed my arm. Another had a silver ring with a red stone. The third, she hesitated. The third called one of the others Rafe when they argued. The sheriff's head snapped up. Rafe, you're sure about that? Yes, he said. Rafe, we don't have time for this. Sheriff Hawkins exchanged a look with Thomas. Rafe Jenkins and his gang have hit 3 stages in the last month. First time they've shot anyone, though. You know who did this? Thomas asked, feeling a surge of anger. We've been tracking them. They usually operate further south, around Elko. The sheriff turned back to Josie. I'll send deputies to search the area around the creek bend. If your fellow passengers are still out there, we'll find them. After the sheriff and doctor left, promising to return with news, Thomas found himself alone with Josie once more. She looked exhausted from the questioning. You should rest, he said gently. Owen brought back some supplies. I can make you something to eat when you wake. Josie settled back against the pillows. You've been very kind, Mr. Porter. Thomas, he corrected with a small smile. After all, you're sleeping in my bed. Seems we should be on a first-name basis. A blush colored her cheeks. Thank you, Thomas, for everything. As she drifted off to sleep, Thomas found himself watching her again, feeling a strange protectiveness he hadn't experienced in years. Whatever happened next, he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't ready for Josephine Miller to leave his life just yet. The next few days fell into an unexpected rhythm. Doc Bennett returned and advised against moving Josie until she'd had more time to recover, so Thomas continued to sleep on a makeshift pallet on the floor while she occupied his bed. During the days when Thomas needed to work with the cattle, Miguel's wife Maria came from the bunkhouse to sit with Josie, bringing simple meals and friendly conversation. By the third day, Josie was strong enough to sit outside on the small porch Thomas had built along the front of the cabin. The fresh air and sunshine seemed to revive her spirits, though the bruise on her temple had darkened to a deep purple before beginning to fade at the edges. "Your land is beautiful," she commented as Thomas joined her after finishing the morning chores. "I can see why you chose this spot." Thomas settled into the chair beside her, looking out over the pasture that rolled gently toward the distant mountains. "It reminded me of Pennsylvania in some ways. The seasons change differently here, but there's the same feeling of space and possibility. You miss your home, sometimes." "My parents are still there and my younger sister." He gazed toward the horizon. "But after the war, everything felt different, smaller somehow. I needed something new." "You fought in the war?" Josie asked softly. Thomas nodded. "Union Army. Enlisted in '63 after my older brother was killed at Gettysburg. Fought until the end." He rarely spoke of those days, but something about Josie's quiet presence made the words come easier. "Came home different. Everyone did." "My father was too old to fight, but he volunteered as a doctor for the Union forces," Josie said. "He never spoke of what he saw, but my mother said he had nightmares until the day he died." Thomas understood all too well. "The dreams get less frequent with time," he said. "At least, that's been my experience." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the rustle of wind through the sage. It was strange, Thomas thought, how natural it felt to have her here, as if the cabin had been waiting for her presence to feel truly complete. The sheriff returned late that afternoon, his expression grim as he dismounted. "We found the stage," he reported, accepting the coffee Thomas offered. "About 2 miles from where you found Miss Miller. The driver didn't make it." "And the other passengers?" Josie asked, her voice tight with anxiety. "Alive, but roughed up pretty badly. The older couple and the businessman are recovering in town. The young miner suffered a broken arm." Sheriff Hawkins paused. "They confirmed your account, said you tried to help the driver before running when one of the robbers turned on you." Josie lowered her eyes. "I should have done more." "You did what you could, Miss Miller. And your description of the men helped us confirm it was Jenkins' gang." The sheriff finished his coffee. "We've sent wires to the surrounding territories. With any luck, they'll be caught before they can hit another stage." Before leaving, the sheriff had one more piece of news. "I sent word to your brother about what happened. He was indeed worried when you didn't arrive. He asked me to tell you he'll come as soon as the school can arrange a substitute, likely in the next day or two." After the sheriff departed, Josie grew quiet, standing at the edge of the porch and gazing out at the land as the sun began to set. "What are you thinking?" Thomas asked, joining her. "That I should feel relieved my ordeal is almost over," she replied softly. "James will come and I'll go to the life I planned in town." "But," Thomas prompted, hearing the hesitation in her voice. She turned to him, the fading sunlight catching the auburn highlights in her hair. "But I find myself strangely reluctant to leave this place. Is that foolish?" "I've only been here a few days." Thomas felt something shift in his chest. "Not foolish at all. This land has a way of settling into your bones quickly." He paused. "And you're welcome to visit whenever you'd like." Josie smiled, the first full smile he'd seen from her. "I'd like that very much." The next morning, Thomas was surprised to find Josie in the kitchen when he returned from his early chores, attempting to manage the cast iron stove. "I thought I might make breakfast," she explained, brushing a strand of hair from her face, "to thank you for your hospitality. Though I confess this stove is more temperamental than I'm used to." Thomas chuckled, moving beside her to adjust the damper. "It has its moods, here like this." They worked side by side, preparing a simple breakfast of biscuits and ham. Thomas was struck by how comfortable it felt, this domestic scene that he'd never experienced in his bachelor existence. Josie moved with a natural grace despite her still healing injury, and her presence filled the cabin with a warmth that had nothing to do with the stove's fire. Over breakfast, Thomas found himself sharing stories of his early days on the ranch, the mishaps and hard lessons that had shaped his life here. In turn, Josie spoke of San Francisco, where she'd worked as a seamstress after her parents' death. "It wasn't what I'd imagined for my life," she admitted, "but the work was steady, and the woman who owned the shop was kind. Still, when James wrote about Awahi, about building a new life here, it seemed like the chance I'd been waiting for. And now, what do you imagine for your future here?" Josie considered the question. "I'm not entirely sure. James wrote that the town needs a proper dressmaker. I have the skills for it." She looked up at him. "What about you? Is this everything you imagined when you came west?" Thomas glanced around the cabin, thinking of the years of labor that had gone into his ranch. "Most of it. The land, the cattle, it's been good." "But," she echoed his question from the previous evening. He smiled wryly. "But a ranch this size should have a proper house by now, not just a cabin. And sometimes the quiet stretches longer than I'd like." Their eyes met across the table, a moment of understanding passing between them that needed no words. There was something growing here, something neither had expected but both were beginning to welcome. The sound of approaching horses interrupted the moment. Thomas rose, looking out the window to see two riders approaching, one he recognized as Sheriff Hawkins, the other a stranger who had to be Josie's brother. James Miller proved to be a scholarly-looking man of about 30, with the same auburn hair as his sister, but none of her delicate features. His relief at finding Josie safe was evident in the way he embraced her the moment he entered the cabin. "When you didn't arrive on the stage, I feared the worst," he said, holding her at arm's length to examine her injury. "And then to get the sheriff's message about the robbery, my God, Josie, I'm so sorry I wasn't there to meet you in Elko." "It wasn't your fault," Josie assured him. "And as you can see, I've been well cared for." James turned to Thomas, extending his hand. "Mr. Porter, I can't thank you enough for what you've done for my sister." "Anyone would have done the same," Thomas replied, though he knew that wasn't entirely true. Many would have hesitated to take in a stranger, especially in these parts. The sheriff had come with news. "We've had word from Elko. Jenkins and his gang hit a bank there yesterday, but the alarm was raised quickly. 2 of the gang were captured, though Jenkins himself escaped." He looked at Josie. "The good news is we recovered some of the stolen items, including this." He handed her a small silver locket. Josie gasped, clutching it to her chest. "My mother's locket." "Oh, thank you, Sheriff." The men we caught are talking, hoping for leniency. "With any luck, we'll have Jenkins himself behind bars soon." The sheriff tipped his hat. "Miss Miller, glad to see you recovering well. Mr. Porter, thank you for your assistance in this matter." After the sheriff left, James turned to his sister. "If you're feeling strong enough, we should head to town. I've prepared the spare room for you, and Mrs. Whitman across the street is eager to meet you. She's been bringing casseroles since she heard what happened." Josie nodded, though Thomas noted a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. "Of course." I just need to gather my things." She paused. "Though there's not much to gather, I'm afraid. The robbers took my carpetbag." "We'll get you whatever you need in town," James assured her. As Josie moved to the bedroom to prepare for departure, James lowered his voice. "Mr. Porter, I truly am grateful for what you've done. If there's ever anything I can do to repay you—" "No repayment necessary," Thomas said firmly. "Just glad I was there to help." James studied him thoughtfully. "You know, we're having a town social next Saturday at the schoolhouse. Nothing fancy, just a way for folks to gather as the weather turns cooler. You'd be welcome to attend." Thomas hesitated. He rarely went to town events, preferring the solitude of his ranch, but the thought of seeing Josie again— "I might just do that. Thank you for the invitation." When Josie emerged, she had changed into a clean dress that Maria had loaned her, her hair neatly brushed and pinned. The bruise on her temple was still visible, but fading, and her color had improved significantly since that first night. "I'm ready," she said, though her voice suggested otherwise. Thomas walked them to the horses James had brought. As her brother mounted his own horse, Thomas helped Josie onto hers, their hands lingering together a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you, Thomas," she said softly, "for everything. Remember what I said. You're welcome here anytime." He stepped back, suddenly aware of how empty the cabin would feel without her. "Perhaps I'll see you in town sometime." "The social on Saturday," James called from his horse. "I've invited Mr. Porter, Josie. Would be good for him to meet some of the townspeople." Josie's face brightened. "You'll come," Thomas nodded. "I believe I will." As he watched them ride away, Thomas felt a mixture of emotions he couldn't quite name. The past few days had shifted something fundamental in his solitary existence, awakening possibilities he'd long since set aside. And as he returned to his empty cabin, he found himself already counting the days until Saturday. The week passed slowly for Thomas. He threw himself into ranch work, fixing fence lines that had waited months for attention, and reorganizing the storage shed with an efficiency that left Miguel and Owen exchanging puzzled glances. By Friday evening, he'd accomplished more than he typically managed in 2 weeks. "Planning on going somewhere, Patron?" Miguel asked as they finished the day's work. Thomas hesitated, then admitted, "Thought I might attend that social in town tomorrow night." Miguel's eyebrows rose, but he merely nodded. "Maria says Miss Miller is recovering well. She's been helping at the school already, despite her brother's protests that she should rest longer." The mention of Josie brought an involuntary smile to Thomas's face. "She struck me as the determined type." "See," Miguel agreed with a knowing look. "The determined ones make the best partners in life, I find." Thomas didn't respond to the gentle prodding, but later, as he scrubbed himself clean in preparation for his trip to town the following day, he found himself wondering what it might be like to have a partner in this life he'd built. His cabin suddenly seemed smaller, more confined than it had before Josie's arrival. The silence, once comfortable, now felt hollow. Saturday arrived with clear skies and a crisp autumn breeze. Thomas spent the morning on chores, then devoted unusual attention to his appearance, trimming his beard, polishing his boots, and donning the good shirt he usually reserved for his infrequent trips to Carson City. When he caught his reflection in the small mirror above the wash basin, he barely recognized the man staring back at him. The ride to Awahi took just over an hour. The town had grown significantly since Thomas had first arrived in Nevada, expanding from a small mining settlement to a proper community with a main street lined with businesses. As he tied his horse outside the schoolhouse, he could hear music and laughter drifting through the open windows. Inside, The single room had been transformed with lanterns and autumn decorations, dried corn husks and gourds arranged artfully around the space. A small band played in one corner while townspeople visited in groups or danced in the cleared center area. Thomas hesitated in the doorway, suddenly uncertain about his decision to come. Before he could reconsider, James Miller spotted him and approached with a welcoming smile. "Mr. Porter, I'm glad you made it. Please come in." Thomas allowed himself to be led further inside, nodding politely as James introduced him to several townsfolk. Everyone seemed to know who he was, the rancher who had rescued Miss Miller, and many expressed gratitude for his actions. "Josie's just helping Mrs. Whitman with the refreshments," James explained, gesturing toward a table laden with food at the far end of the room. "She'll be pleased you came." As if summoned by her name, Josie appeared, carrying a tray of cups. She wore a simple blue dress that complemented her auburn hair, which was arranged in a more elaborate style than he'd seen at the ranch. The bruise on her temple had faded to a faint yellow, barely visible in the warm lantern light. When she spotted Thomas, her face lit up with a smile that made his heart stumble in his chest. "Thomas, you came." Setting down the tray, she made her way through the crowd to greet him. "I said I would," he replied, suddenly aware of how much he'd missed her presence over the past days. "How are you feeling?" "Much better. Almost completely healed." She gestured to the festive room. "What do you think of our little social?" "It's lively," Thomas offered, making her laugh. "Not quite what you're used to on your ranch, I imagine." She touched his arm lightly. "Come, let me introduce you to some people, unless you'd prefer to stand against the wall all evening." Her teasing tone put him at ease, and Thomas allowed her to guide him through the gathering. He met the town doctor, the proprietor of the general store, the banker and his wife, and various other citizens of Awahi. To his surprise, many expressed interest in his ranching operation, asking intelligent questions about his cattle and methods. "You're something of a local legend, you know," Josie confided as they finally found a moment alone by the refreshment table. "The solitary rancher who tamed that stretch of wilderness single-handedly." Thomas shook his head, embarrassed. "Hardly single-handed. I've had help." "Still, what you've built is impressive." She handed him a cup of punch. "James took me out that way yesterday so I could retrieve the dress Maria loaned me. Your land looks different from the road, more expansive. You were nearby." "You should have stopped in," Thomas said, unable to hide his disappointment at the missed opportunity. "I wanted to," Josie admitted, her eyes meeting his. But James was concerned about proper appearances. Thomas understood immediately. A single woman visiting a bachelor's ranch alone would certainly cause talk in a small town like Awahi. Still, the knowledge that she'd wanted to see him again warmed him in a way the punch couldn't. "Perhaps next time you could bring your brother along," he suggested. "I'd be happy to show you both the improvements I've been making." Before Josie could respond, the band struck up a lively reel and several couples moved to the dance floor. Thomas watched, content to observe, until Josie turned to him with raised eyebrows. "You dance, Mr. Porter?" Thomas hesitated. "It's been a while." "Then it's high time you remembered how." She set down her cup and held out her hand, a challenge in her eyes. He couldn't refuse. Taking her hand, he led her to the dance floor, grateful that his mother had insisted on teaching all her children the basic steps of common dances. As they joined the formation, Thomas found the movements coming back to him naturally. Josie was light on her feet, her eyes sparkling with enjoyment as they circled each other, joined hands, separated, and came together again as the dance required. The exertion brought a flush to her cheeks that enhanced her beauty, and Thomas found himself mesmerized by the joy radiating from her. When the music ended, Neither moved away immediately. They stood in the center of the floor, slightly breathless, until the band began a slower, more intimate waltz. Without asking, Thomas placed his hand at her waist, continuing to hold her other hand in his. Josie stepped closer, her skirts brushing against his legs as they began to move in time to the music. "I never properly thanked you," she said softly as they turned slowly around the floor, "for saving my life." "You did thank me," Thomas reminded her. "Words don't seem adequate." Her eyes held his, sincere and warm. "I've been thinking about you, about those days at your ranch." Thomas swallowed, suddenly aware of how closely they were observed by the other dancers. "I've been thinking about you too." The waltz ended too soon. As they stepped apart, Thomas noticed James watching them with an expression he couldn't quite interpret, not disapproval exactly, but certainly thoughtful. The rest of the evening passed in a pleasant blur. Thomas danced with Josie twice more, conversed with various townspeople, and even found himself enjoying the simple pleasure of community that had been absent from his life for so long. As the social began to wind down, he realized with surprise that he was reluctant for the evening to end. As guests began to depart, Josie found him near the door. "Will you be returning to your ranch tonight? It's getting late." "I had planned to," Thomas acknowledged, glancing outside where darkness had fully fallen. "The ride's not so bad, even at night. James has a spare room," she offered. "I'm sure he wouldn't mind if you stayed, rather than risking the trail after dark." The invitation was tempting, primarily because it would mean more time in Josie's company. But before Thomas could respond, James joined them. "Mr. Porter, I couldn't help overhearing." "Josie's right, you're welcome to our spare room. The roads aren't safe at night, especially with Jenkins still at large." Put that way, Thomas found it hard to refuse. "That's very kind of you if it's truly no trouble." "None at all," James assured him. "Consider it the least we can do in return for your care of my sister." The Miller home was a modest but comfortable house near the school, with a small garden that Josie had already begun to arrange to her liking. Inside, the furnishings were simple but well chosen, reflecting James's scholarly nature and, Thomas suspected, Josie's recent influence in making the bachelor quarters more homelike. After showing Thomas to the spare room, James excused himself to check on a neighbor's child who had been ill, leaving Thomas and Josie alone in the small parlor. "Your brother seems well respected in town," Thomas observed as they sat before the fire. "He is. The town needed a teacher badly, and he's brought real learning to children who might otherwise have gone without." Pride colored her voice. "He's always been the intellectual one in the family." "And you're the practical one," Thomas guessed. Josie smiled. "Something like that. Father always said I had more common sense than was ladylike." Her expression softened at the memory. "They would have liked you, I think. My parents." The simple statement carried a weight that made Thomas's heart beat faster. "I'm sorry I never got to meet them," he said quietly. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the crackling fire the only sound in the room. Finally, Thomas asked the question that had been on his mind all evening. "How do you find Awahi? Is it becoming home for you?" Josie considered the question thoughtfully. "It's beginning to. The people have been kind, especially since." She gestured to her healing temple. "And there's certainly need for my skills. Mrs. Whitman has already commissioned 3 dresses." "That's good," Thomas said, genuinely pleased for her success. "But I find myself thinking of your ranch often," she continued, her voice softer. "The space, the quiet, the way the land stretches to the horizon. It felt right somehow." Her eyes met his. Or perhaps it was the company. Thomas felt a surge of emotion he couldn't quite name. "The cabin was empty after you left," he admitted. "I never noticed the silence before, but now." The front door opened as James returned, interrupting the moment. Yet as they said their good nights and retired to their separate rooms, Thomas carried with him the memory of Josie's expression, open, hopeful, and filled with the same longing he felt stirring in his own heart. The following morning, Thomas joined the Millers for breakfast before preparing to return to his ranch. James had early duties at the school, leaving shortly after they ate, but not before extending another invitation. "The Harvest Festival is in 2 weeks," he mentioned casually. "Much like last night, but with more emphasis on food and less on dancing. The whole town participates." "I'll consider it," Thomas replied, though in truth, he was already planning to attend. After James departed, Josie walked with Thomas to retrieve his horse from the town stable. The morning was bright and cool, the streets just beginning to come alive with Sunday activity. "I'm glad you came to the social," Josie said as they walked side by side. "It meant a great deal to me." "I enjoyed it more than I expected," Thomas admitted. "Though I suspect the company had much to do with that." Josie smiled, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. "Would you think me forward if I asked to visit your ranch again? James is concerned with appearances, but I thought perhaps if I came with Mrs. Whitman to deliver some supplies." "You're welcome anytime, with or without Mrs. Whitman," Thomas said firmly. "Though I understand your brother's concerns." They reached the stable where Thomas's horse waited, already saddled by the stable boy. As Thomas checked the cinch and bridle, Josie stood nearby, clearly reluctant for him to leave. "Will you write to me?" she asked suddenly. "It would be nice to receive letters, even though we're not so far apart." The request surprised and pleased him. "I'm not much of a letter writer," he cautioned, "but for you, I'll try." As he mounted his horse, Josie reached up to touch his hand where it rested on the saddle. "Safe journey, Thomas. I hope to see you again soon." The ride back to his ranch seemed shorter than usual. His thoughts filled with memories of dancing with Josie, of their conversation by the fire, of the way her eyes had held his as they said goodbye. Thomas Porter, who had built his life around solitude and self-reliance, found himself eagerly anticipating his next visit to town. True to his word, Thomas wrote to Josie that very evening. The letter was simple, expressing his enjoyment of the social and his appreciation for the Millers' hospitality. He included a few details about his ranch, a new calf born that morning, plans for expanding the corral, and ended with an open invitation for her to visit whenever she wished. To his surprise, Josie's reply arrived just 2 days later, delivered by Owen, who had gone to town for supplies. Her handwriting was neat and expressive, her letter full of details about her budding dressmaking business and life in Awahi. She wrote of her growing friendship with Mrs. Whitman, of James's dedication to his students, of her plans to create a small garden like the one their mother had maintained back east. Thus began a correspondence that bridged the physical distance between them. Though they lived less than a day's ride apart, the letters allowed them to share thoughts and feelings that might have been harder to express face to face. Thomas found himself looking forward to Owen's trips to town, knowing he would return with another letter from Josie. A week after the social, Thomas received not just a letter but an invitation. Mrs. Whitman was planning to visit several outlying ranches to measure the women for winter dresses, and she had asked Josie to accompany her as an assistant. They would be visiting the neighboring Carson Ranch first, then Thomas's property the following day. The news filled Thomas with anticipation. He spent the intervening days ensuring the cabin was as presentable as possible, even going so far as to construct a proper chair for the porch to complement the one already there. Miguel's wife Maria, sensing his nervous energy, offered to prepare special dishes for the visitor's arrival. When the day finally came, Thomas found himself watching the road more often than his cattle. He spotted the approaching buggy shortly after midday and hurried to meet it as it pulled up to the cabin. Mrs. Whitman proved to be a plump, cheerful widow in her 50s who greeted Thomas with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had heard much about him. "Mr. Porter, a pleasure to finally meet the man who's become the talk of Awahi. Josie has told me so much about your beautiful ranch." Beside her, Josie smiled at Thomas, her eyes conveying a private greeting that warmed him through. She looked lovely in a deep green traveling dress, her auburn hair partially hidden beneath a practical bonnet. "Welcome to both of you," Thomas said, helping them down from the buggy. "I hope your journey wasn't too tiring." "Not at all," Mrs. Whitman assured him, glancing around approvingly. "What a charming place you've built here, Mr. Porter. Quite impressive for a bachelor establishment." They settled on the porch with refreshments Maria had prepared, Mrs. Whitman dominating the conversation with news of town happenings and commentary on the Carson ranch they had just visited. Thomas was content to listen, occasionally catching Josie's eye and sharing a smile at some particularly enthusiastic observation from their companion. When Mrs. Whitman announced her intention to rest before their return journey, retiring to the bedroom Thomas had prepared for her, he and Josie finally had a moment alone. "I've missed this place," Josie said softly as they stood at the edge of the porch, looking out over the land. "Though it looks different than I remember." "I've made some improvements," Thomas acknowledged, gesturing to the new corral and the extended garden plot. "Keeping busy. Your letters suggested as much." She turned to face him fully. "I've enjoyed our correspondence, Thomas. It's become the highlight of my days." The simple admission sent a surge of pleasure through him. "For me as well," he confessed, "though I find I prefer seeing you in person." Josie's smile deepened. "Mrs. Whitman has been very understanding about my desire to accompany her on these fittings. I think she suspects my interest isn't entirely professional." "And is she right?" Thomas asked, daring to voice the question that had been growing in his mind over the weeks. Instead of answering directly, Josie reached into her pocket and withdrew a folded paper. "I received this yesterday. It's from the sheriff." Thomas took the paper, reading quickly. It was brief but clear. Raphael Jenkins had been captured attempting to cross into California. He and his remaining gang members were in custody in Carson City, awaiting trial. "That's excellent news," Thomas said, returning the letter. "You must be relieved." "I am. But it also made me realize something." Josie's expression grew serious. "When I first came to Awahi, I was seeking safety and security after losing my parents. James offered that and I was grateful. But these past weeks, as I've settled into town life, written to you, thought about that night you found me by the creek." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I realized I want more than just safety. I want purpose, connection, the chance to build something meaningful." Thomas felt his heart rate quicken. "And have you found those things in Awahi?" "Some," she admitted. "But not all." Her eyes held his steadily. "That day by the creek when you whispered, 'Wake up, your battle is over,' I didn't fully understand then what battle you meant. But I think perhaps it was the battle I'd been fighting with myself, trying to find where I truly belong." Thomas took her hand, emboldened by her words. "And have you found that place?" Before she could answer, Mrs. Whitman emerged from the cabin, announcing she was refreshed and ready to continue their work. The moment between Thomas and Josie passed, but the question lingered in the air between them as Mrs. Whitman efficiently measured Thomas for new shirts, insisting that a man in his position should have proper attire for town visits. As the women prepared to depart, Thomas walked Josie to the buggy while Mrs. Whitman gathered her supplies. "You never answered my question," he reminded her quietly. Josie glanced toward Mrs. Whitman, then back to Thomas. "The Harvest Festival is next weekend," she said. "Come to town, stay for Sunday services too, and then perhaps I'll have your answer." It was both a promise and a gentle challenge. Thomas nodded, helping her into the buggy. "I'll be there." As he watched them drive away, Thomas felt a certainty settling in his chest. Whatever Josie's answer might be, his own heart had already decided its course. The Harvest Festival exceeded the social in both size and energy. The entire town of Awahi and many from the surrounding ranches and farms gathered to celebrate the season's bounty. Tables groaned under the weight of food, children raced through the streets in organized games, and a larger band provided constant music. Thomas arrived early, having spent the previous evening at the town hotel rather than risking a dawn ride. He found Josie helping to arrange the display of preserves and baked goods being judged as part of the festivities. "You came," she said, her face lighting up as she spotted him. "I said I would," Thomas replied, echoing their exchange from the social. "Need any help?" Together they finished setting up the tables, working in comfortable tandem that drew knowing looks from several townswomen. Thomas found he didn't mind the speculation. In fact, he welcomed the town's recognition of his growing attachment to Josie. Throughout the day, they were rarely apart. They sampled foods from the various tables, applauded the children's recitations, and danced when the music called for it. James joined them occasionally, but seemed content to leave his sister in Thomas's company, a fact that didn't escape Thomas's notice. As evening approached and lanterns were lit around the town square, Josie led Thomas away from the festivities to a quiet spot behind the schoolhouse. A small bench sat beneath an oak tree, offering privacy while still within proper distance of the celebration. "I've been thinking about your question," Josie said as they sat together. "About whether I've found where I belong." Thomas waited, his heart beating steadily in his chest. In the distance, the music and laughter of the festival continued, but here in this quiet moment, the world had narrowed to just the two of them. "When I first arrived in Awahi, I thought my place was here, with James building a new life in town," she continued. "And I do love my brother, and the town has been welcoming." "But," Thomas prompted gently. Josie turned to face him fully. "But then I spent those days at your ranch, recovering. I watched you work the land, care for your animals, build something from nothing but your own two hands." Her voice softened. "I saw the way you look at that land with love and pride and purpose, and I realized that's what I want too. Not just a safe place to exist, but a place to truly live, to build something alongside someone who shares that vision." Thomas took her hands in his. "Josie, are you saying?" "I'm saying that when I think about where I belong, I think about your ranch, about that porch with the two chairs, about the garden I could expand, the home we could build to replace that cabin." Her eyes shone in the dim light. "I'm saying I think I belong with you, Thomas Porter, if you'll have me." For a man often short on words, Thomas found them flowing freely now. "From the moment I found you by that creek, something changed in me. My life before was orderly but empty. You filled spaces I didn't even know were vacant." He squeezed her hands gently. "I love you, Josephine Miller, and nothing would make me happier than building a life with you." Josie's smile was radiant as she leaned forward. "Then I believe you have your answer." Their first kiss was gentle, a promise exchanged beneath the oak tree while the Harvest Festival continued in the distance. When they returned to the celebration, hand in hand, few were surprised by the evident change in their relationship. James met them near the punch table, his expression knowing. "I wondered how long it would take you two to come to an understanding," he said, offering each a cup. "Should I be planning a wedding soon?" Josie looked to Thomas, who nodded. "With your blessing, James," he said formally, "I'd like to ask for your sister's hand in marriage." James considered them both, his expression softening. "My blessing you have, wholeheartedly. I've seen how you look at each other, and while I'll miss having Josie in town, I can't think of a better man to entrust with her happiness." The following morning, Thomas attended Sunday services for the first time since arriving in Nevada. Sitting beside Josie in the small church, he felt a sense of community he'd long forgotten. After the service, they announced their engagement, receiving congratulations from what seemed like the entire town. As they walked together afterward, planning their future, Thomas marveled at how much had changed since that fateful evening by the creek. Had he ridden a different trail that day, had he left the ranch an hour earlier or later, their paths might never have crossed. "What are you thinking?" Josie asked, noting his thoughtful expression. "About chance, fate, whatever you want to call it," he replied. "If I hadn't found you that day." "But you did," she said simply. "You found me, and you whispered those words that somehow reached through the darkness. 'Wake up, your battle is over.'" She squeezed his hand. And it was. That moment marked the end of one journey and the beginning of another one we'll travel together. As they continued walking, Thomas Porter, once the solitary rancher of Awahi, felt the last empty spaces in his heart filling with a joy he'd never dared to imagine. The battle against loneliness, against the shadows of the past, was indeed over. And what lay ahead was a future brighter than either of them could have dreamed. The wedding took place 6 weeks later, just as the first snow dusted the Nevada landscape. The entire town of Awahi turned out for the occasion, transforming the small church into a haven of warmth and celebration amidst the winter chill. Josie wore a dress of her own design, ivory silk with delicate embroidery that had kept her busy during the weeks of their engagement. Thomas, at James's insistence, had traveled to Carson City for a proper suit, feeling strangely transformed by the formal attire. "Never thought I'd see the day Thomas Porter got himself hitched," remarked Sheriff Hawkins as they gathered outside the church after the ceremony. "Figured you for a confirmed bachelor." "So did I," Thomas admitted, his eyes finding Josie across the crowd where she stood with Mrs. Whitman and several other townswomen. "Life has a way of surprising you." The celebration continued at the town hall, where tables had been arranged for a feast contributed by nearly every household in Awahi. Music, dancing, and heartfelt toasts filled the evening, but Thomas found himself eager for the festivities to end, anxious to begin their life together properly. When they finally departed, it was in a wagon decorated by the schoolchildren with ribbons and small bouquets of dried flowers. James hugged his sister tightly before helping her into the wagon. "You'll visit soon?" Josie asked him. "Of course." "Though perhaps not too soon," he added with a meaningful smile that made her blush. The ride to the ranch was quiet, both lost in thoughts of the day and the future stretching before them. As they approached the cabin, now their home, Thomas slowed the horses. "I should carry you across the threshold," he said. "That's the tradition, isn't it?" Josie smiled. "I believe it is." He helped her down from the wagon, then swept her into his arms, her wedding dress billowing around them as he carried her to the cabin door. Inside, they found the space transformed. Maria had cleaned thoroughly, arranged fresh linens on the bed, and left a small meal warming by the fire. "Welcome home, Mrs. Porter," Thomas said softly, setting Josie on her feet but keeping her close in his arms. "Home," she repeated, looking around the cabin with new eyes. "Our home." Later, as they lay together in the quiet darkness, the wind whispering around the cabin eaves, Thomas marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. From that first desperate whisper by the creek to the sacred vows they'd exchanged today, Each step had led them here, to this perfect union of hearts and lives. "What are you thinking?" Josie asked, her head resting on his chest. "That I'm the luckiest man in Nevada territory," he replied honestly. "And that I plan to spend every day making sure you never regret choosing this life with me." She raised herself on one elbow to look at him in the faint firelight. "I could never regret it. This is exactly where I'm meant to be." As winter settled over the land, Thomas and Josie fell into a rhythm of shared life that seemed to have always existed between them. The cabin, once merely functional, became truly a home under Josie's influence. She arranged the simple furnishings more comfortably, hung curtains she'd sewn herself at the windows, and added touches that transformed the space: a quilt across the bed, a vase of dried wildflowers on the table, books arranged on newly built shelves. Outside, even in winter's grip, plans took shape. Together they walked the property, discussing where to build the larger house they both envisioned, where to expand the garden come spring, how to improve the cattle operation in the coming year. Thomas found that Josie's practical mind complemented his own, her suggestions often illuminating possibilities he hadn't considered. "My father always said two minds working together accomplish more than twice what one can alone," Josie remarked one evening as they reviewed the accounts for the ranch. "I'm beginning to understand what he meant." The ranch prospered under their joint stewardship. Thomas hired 2 more hands to help with the expanding herd, while Josie continued her dressmaking business from the ranch, receiving occasional visits from town clients and working on commission for the general store in Awahi. James visited regularly, often staying overnight in the small addition Thomas and the ranch hands had built onto the cabin during the winter months. He brought news from town and took obvious pleasure in seeing his sister's happiness in her new life. "She was always the one who kept our family together after Mother died," James confided to Thomas during one such visit, as they watched Josie in the distance, instructing the newest ranch hand on proper care for the kitchen garden she'd established. "Father and I had our books, but Josie was the practical one who made sure we ate and had clean clothes and didn't get lost in our grief. I worried when she came west that she'd merely continue that role with me, never finding her own path." He clapped Thomas on the shoulder. "I needn't have worried." Spring arrived with renewed energy across the land. The cattle grazed on fresh grass, new calves wobbled alongside their mothers, and Josie's garden erupted in vibrant growth. Construction began on their new house, a proper structure with multiple rooms that would serve them for years to come. It was during the house raising, with neighbors and townspeople gathered to help raise the frame, that Josie pulled Thomas aside, her expression a mixture of nervousness and joy. "I have news," she said quietly, leading him away from the busy construction site. Thomas waited, concern flickering as he noted her serious expression. "Is everything all right?" "More than all right." She took his hands, placing them gently against her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby, Thomas, in the autumn." For a moment, Thomas couldn't speak, overwhelmed by emotion. Then he gathered Josie into his arms, lifting her off her feet in his excitement. "A baby? Are you certain?" "Dr. Bennett confirmed it yesterday when I was in town," she said, laughing at his enthusiasm. "He says everything appears healthy." Thomas set her down gently, suddenly anxious. "Should you be out here? Should you be resting?" Josie shook her head, amused by his concern. "I'm perfectly fine and will be for months yet. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, you know. Most of them while continuing to work their farms and homes." Despite her reassurances, Thomas found himself watching her more closely in the weeks that followed, insisting she rest more frequently and taking on some of her usual chores. Josie tolerated his protectiveness with good humor, though she drew the line when he suggested she might stop riding her horse. "I'll stop when I can no longer see my own feet," she declared firmly. "Until then, I plan to continue living normally." The new house was completed by midsummer. A sturdy two-story structure with a broad front porch and ample windows to catch the breeze. Moving from the cabin was bittersweet. It had been their first home together. After all but the space and comfort of the new house were welcome, especially as Josie's pregnancy progressed and her mobility decreased. They converted one of the upstairs bedrooms into a nursery, painting the walls a soft yellow and installing the cradle Thomas had crafted during the long winter evenings. Maria taught Josie to knit, resulting in tiny booties and blankets that accumulated in a drawer, waiting for their occupant. As autumn approached, bringing with it the harvest and cattle sales that would secure their finances for the coming year, Josie's time grew near. Dr. Bennett made regular trips from town to check on her progress, always departing with reassurances that everything was proceeding normally. "First babies often take their time," he told Thomas during one such visit. "Don't be alarmed if she goes past her expected date." But the baby had other ideas. 2 weeks before Josie's predicted time, Thomas awoke to her hand gripping his arm, her face tense with discomfort. "It's starting," she said simply. The next 12 hours were the longest of Thomas's life. Banished from the bedroom by Maria, who had borne 5 children of her own and knew more about childbirth than Dr. Bennett, Thomas paced the house, jumping at every sound from upstairs. Miguel tried to distract him with ranch business, but Thomas could focus on nothing but the occasional cries from his wife. When Dr. Bennett arrived, summoned by a ranch hand sent to town at the first signs of labor, he found Thomas wild-eyed with worry. "Perfectly normal," the doctor assured him, climbing the stairs to join Maria. "First babies are rarely easy, but your wife is strong and healthy." The sun was setting when the cry of an infant finally pierced the air. Thomas, who had been sitting with his head in his hands at the kitchen table, leapt to his feet, taking the stairs 2 at a time. He paused outside the bedroom door, suddenly uncertain until Maria opened it with a broad smile. "Come meet your son, Patron." Inside, Josie reclined against pillows, her face exhausted but radiant as she cradled a small bundle wrapped in one of the blankets she'd knitted. She looked up as Thomas entered, her smile deepening. "Come see what we've made," she said softly. Thomas approached the bed on unsteady legs, sitting carefully beside her. She tilted the bundle so he could see the tiny face of his son, red and wrinkled but perfect in every way. A tuft of dark hair, already showing signs of his mother's auburn tint, crowned his head. "He's beautiful," Thomas whispered, reaching out to touch the infant's cheek with a tentative finger. The baby turned toward the touch, his mouth working in a reflex that made Thomas's heart swell with love and protectiveness. "Would you like to hold him?" Josie asked, already shifting the bundle toward him. Thomas accepted his son with careful hands, cradling him as though he were made of the finest porcelain. The weight of him, so small yet so significant, settled not just in Thomas's arms but in his soul. This was his child, his and Josie's, a new life they had created together. "What shall we call him?" he asked, looking up at Josie. They had discussed names but hadn't settled on one, preferring to wait until they met the child. Now, looking at his son's face, Thomas felt certain inspirations would come. "I was thinking James after my brother," Josie suggested. "James Thomas Porter, James Thomas," Thomas repeated, testing the name. It felt right, honorable. "Welcome to the world, James Thomas Porter, Doctor." Bennett, who had been packing his supplies across the room, approached with a smile. "He's a fine, healthy boy, and your wife has done remarkably well for a first birth." He clapped Thomas on the shoulder. "Congratulations, Mr. Porter. You're a father now." The words struck Thomas with their simple truth. He was a father. This tiny being depended on him completely, would look to him for guidance, protection, and love. It was a responsibility both terrifying and exhilarating. After the doctor departed and Maria went downstairs to prepare food for the new mother, Thomas and Josie were left alone with their son. The baby had fallen asleep in Thomas's arms, his tiny chest rising and falling in a rhythm that mesmerized his father. "Are you happy?" Josie asked softly, watching Thomas's face as he gazed at their child. Thomas looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "More than I ever thought possible," he admitted. "When I found you by that creek, I never imagined." He shook his head, words failing him. "I know." Josie reached out to touch his arm. "Life takes unexpected turns. Sometimes the most painful moments lead us to the greatest joys." Thomas carefully returned little James to her arms, then stretched out beside her on the bed, his arm around her shoulders as they both gazed at their son. "I love you," he whispered against her hair. "Both of you, more than I have words to express." Josie leaned into him, her exhaustion evident but her happiness radiating through it. "We love you too, and this is just the beginning." As the first stars appeared outside their window, the Porter family rested together, bound by love and the promise of all the days to come. Thomas thought back to that moment by the creek, to the unconscious woman he'd found and the words he'd whispered. "Wake up, your battle is over." He couldn't have known then how prophetic those words would be, not just for Josie, but for himself as well. The battle against loneliness, against the emptiness that had shadowed him since the war, was truly over. In its place was this: a family, a purpose, a love that would sustain him through whatever challenges life might bring. As his son stirred against his mother's breast, and Josie smiled up at him with tired eyes, Thomas Porter knew with absolute certainty that he had found his place in the world, here on this land, with these people who had become his heart's true home. In the years that followed, the Porter Ranch flourished. The cattle operation expanded until Thomas was known as one of the most successful ranchers in the territory. Their home became a gathering place for neighbors and friends, with Josie's warmth and hospitality drawing people from miles around. James Thomas grew into a sturdy boy with his mother's auburn hair and his father's quiet determination. He was joined 2 years later by a sister, Elizabeth Marie, and then, 3 years after that, by another brother, William James. The Porter children filled the house with laughter and activity, turning what had once been a solitary existence into a bustling family life that Thomas cherished. Josie's dressmaking business grew alongside the ranch, eventually expanding into a small shop in town managed by a young woman she had trained. This arrangement allowed Josie to balance her work with her family responsibilities, spending most of her time at the ranch, but making regular trips to town to oversee the business. James Miller remained in Awahi, continuing as the town's teacher, and eventually marrying a young widow with 2 children of her own. He was a frequent visitor to the ranch, delighting in his role as uncle to the Porter children, and maintaining the close relationship with his sister that had brought them west in the first place. On the 10th anniversary of the day Thomas found Josie by the creek, they held a celebration at the ranch, inviting friends and neighbors to share in their happiness. As dusk fell and lanterns were lit around the property, Thomas found Josie standing alone on the porch, watching their 3 children playing with the other youngsters in the yard. "Happy anniversary," he said, joining her and slipping an arm around her waist. She leaned into him, her body fitting against his as naturally as it had from the first. 10 years. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I woke up to find a concerned stranger dabbing at my head wound." Thomas chuckled. And sometimes it feels like you've always been here, like this ranch was incomplete until you arrived. Josie turned in his arms to face him. At 35, she was more beautiful to him than ever, the years having added character to her face without diminishing its loveliness. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd taken a different trail that day? Sometimes, Thomas admitted. But then I think about how empty my life would be without you, without our children, and I'm grateful for whatever twist of fate led me to that creek at that moment. I used to think it was just chance, Josie said thoughtfully, but now I'm not so sure. There are too many pieces that had to align: the robbery, my escape, your decision to ride that way at that time. She smiled up at him. Perhaps we were always meant to find each other. Perhaps we were, Thomas agreed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. All I know is that the moment I saw you by that creek, something inside me recognized you, even before I knew your name. From the yard came the sound of their eldest son calling for them to join the dancing that had started around the bonfire. Josie laughed, taking Thomas's hand. "Come, Mr. Porter, our family is waiting." Together they descended the porch steps and crossed to where their children stood. James, now 9 and already showing signs of the man he would become, greeted them with his father's serious expression. 8-year-old Elizabeth, the image of her mother but with Thomas's dark eyes, tugged at her father's hand, eager to dance. And 5-year-old William, a perfect blend of them both, watched the festivities with wide-eyed wonder. As the music played and neighbors clapped in rhythm, Thomas danced with his wife under the stars, surrounded by the life they had built together. From tragedy had come joy. From a chance encounter by a creek had grown a legacy of love and family that would endure long after they were gone. "I love you, Josephine Porter," Thomas whispered as they moved to the music. "Today and always." "And I love you," she replied, her eyes reflecting the firelight and the depth of her feelings. "My rescuer, my partner, my heart." Around them, the celebration continued, friends laughing, children playing, the ranch hands and their families enjoying the festivities. This was the home they had created, not just the buildings and land, but the community and connections that gave it meaning. As the night deepened and the younger children began to tire, Thomas and Josie gathered their family onto the porch to watch the final dances around the bonfire. William dozed against his mother's shoulder while James and Elizabeth fought to stay awake just a little longer. "Time for bed, I think," Josie said softly, rising with William in her arms. Thomas nodded, guiding his older children inside despite their protests. The guests would continue celebrating for hours yet, but the Porter family had their own quiet rituals to observe before the day ended. After the children were tucked into bed, Thomas and Josie returned to the porch, watching as the party gradually wound down and guests began to depart. The night was clear, stars scattered across the sky in brilliant profusion, the same stars that had watched over them for a decade of shared life. "It's been a good 10 years, Thomas reflected, his arm around Josie's shoulders. "The best," she agreed, "and many more to come." As the last guests departed and silence settled over the ranch, Thomas Porter gazed out at the land he had tamed and the home he had built. Once, he had thought success meant independence, standing alone against the challenges of the frontier. Now he understood that true strength came from connection to the land, to community, and most of all, to the woman beside him who had transformed his life from the moment he found her unconscious by the creek and whispered those fateful words. "Wake up, your battle is over." Their battle was indeed over, but their journey together, their life of love, family, and purpose, would continue for all the days to come, as enduring as the Nevada landscape that had brought them together and the love that had made them whole.